Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out. Tonight we welcome Dr. Kimberly Nagy. She is a retired trauma surgeon and a professional genealogist. She is going to present to us Dropsy, Quincy, and Consumption. Just what did my ancestor have? So thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you. Okay, this is always the tricky part. This worked earlier. Can you see my screen? Okay, so we are going to talk about some of the diseases that our ancestors may have had and why we would care to know about them. And we'll talk first about how to find out what exactly was wrong with our ancestors. And we'll touch on some of the various record types that we'll use in order to try and determine that. Most of this is cause of death, and that's only because those records are much more plentiful than illnesses, but we will touch on illnesses as well. So starting off with death records. Now, death records for most of the country were not kept until the late 1800s and sometimes even later than that. If you're lucky enough to have ancestors in New England, you'll have death records a little bit earlier. But basically, the late 1800s, the government started to realize that diseases were could be passed from one person to another. And so for public health reasons, they decided they wanted to help track diseases, possibly learn, where perhaps a cluster of disease was that might be passed on to someone else that they could prevent. So the National Board of Health was formed in 1879, and they started to require local governments to keep death records. So this is an example of a death register. This is from Ohio, but is very similar to some death registers you might see in other locations. And there's a column, in addition to the usual name and date of death and possibly age, location of death, there's a column that gives you the cause of death. And this is where we learn what the ancestor might have. Let me turn on my little pointer here. Okay, so you'll see here some of the causes of death. We've got scrofula, we've got rheumatism, we've got consumption, we've got dropsy. Of course, the all-time favorite is unknown cause of death. Now, keep in mind that 100 years and more ago, physicians didn't really have all the tools that they have today. They didn't have x-rays, they didn't have CT scans, MRIs, they didn't even really have basic blood tests. So a lot of these diagnoses were based on sort of what the patient looked like, any outward symptoms that the patient may have. In addition, a lot of these terms are fairly archaic, and we'll touch on how to find out what archaic terms mean. Now, the state health department got involved in the early 1900s and started having a standardized death form. In Illinois, it was in 1916. Other states are, similar dates. And you'll see a form such as this, a death certificate. And I think, we're all pretty familiar with seeing forms like this. And these forms were kept, they were recorded at the county level, and then they were sent to the state. And in Illinois, you can access them through the state archives. So it gives you, again, a lot of information: the decedent's name, his birth date, any spouse, hopefully parents. We've all used these in these type of certificates. But for our purposes, we'll focus in on the cause of death. And here we have, this is my great-grandfather. He died of cerebral hemorrhage, contributory by arteriosclerosis. And you'll notice there's a little date or a little number over here under the column that says date. No date, but there's a little number, and we'll discuss those numbers in a little bit more detail as we go on. Now, other places you might find a record of death, and certainly before counties and states started to record them, would be in the church records. You know, the minister would very dutifully write down who he gave a funeral sermon for, who was buried in the churchyard, and so on. So you can find church records going back much earlier. For example, this church record dates from the mid-1700s. And this minister very kindly gave us not only genealogical information, we've got, you know, Mary, the wife of Samuel Hovey, so we've got a spouse's name, death date, and what she died of. So here's fever and dysentery, bloody flux. Again, unusual terminology, but that's what they had to work with. More modern death records or information about death can be obtained from obituaries. And the obituary may come out and list the cause of death. Here, my grandfather died of appendicitis at the age of 24, or just under 24. Here, my sister-in-law died of leukemia. Now, if it doesn't say that, sometimes it just says died after a long extended illness or something like that. You might get a clue by, you know, instead of flowers, please donate to such and such a charity. American Cancer Society, okay, good bet that they died of cancer. Leukemia Society is in this case, she died of leukemia. So that gives you a clue, even though it may not actually come out and say it. Other things you might find in the newspaper, it may not necessarily be a cause of death, but it might be an illness. This is not that long ago. This is only 60 years ago. Hospital notes. These patients were admitted to the Pinckneyville Community Hospital, and it gives you their names. These patients were discharged. So now you know if your neighbor went to the hospital or not. Or this example here we have Jesse Strickland has a siege with inflammatory rheumatism. You know, it's nothing like your neighbors knowing all your health history right there in the newspaper. So those are maybe not causes of death, but illnesses, and you know that they were hospitalized for something. Another place that we look as an alternate record of death might be a funeral home record. And this comes from Clay County, Indiana, and it's a transcription of a funeral director's record. So again, similar to that church record where we saw who was, you know, being buried, the funeral director in this case, in addition to some genealogical information, gives us cause of death, consumption, spinal meningitis, stillborn, consumption, pneumonia, and so on. Again, another place that you can look. Cemeteries may have disease information as well. This is from Springfield. And the Oak Ridge Cemetery, these are interment records, and these are online at the Illinois Digital Archives. And this record again lists, you've got the decedent's name, where they're buried, the lot number and such. Again, this is a cemetery record. Some information, date of death, place of birth, and again, for our purposes, cause of death. And we have in 1865, we have someone who died of measles, hip disease, I'm not quite sure what that might be, and good old Abraham Lincoln, who died from assassination. Now, if an autopsy was performed, you might be able to find a coroner record, and that will usually specify what they assumed was the cause of death. And some of these are online. This is an example on Family Search. This is Coles County, Illinois, down in Mattoon area. And here you have the verdict of the coroner's jury. This person died of carcinoma of the prostate, as well as some, other contributing causes. The Secretary of State in Missouri has an index to their coroner records in Missouri. And again, this is an index. So if you find this, you want to get the original record if it's your ancestor. But we have the person's name, the date of death, and the cause of death. Now, sometimes not only does this give you a clue to what they died of, but it can give you a clue to their occupation. Here Jacob Baumgartner died from falling while he was working on the railroad. So now you have an idea what he did for a living. Another example might be someone who died of black lung. You might go searching for records relating to coal mining for his occupation. There are some hospital records online, not a lot. The Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, otherwise known as HIPAA, was enacted in 1996. And so anything more recent is going to be much harder to access. But some of the old hospital records are online, and the trick is finding them. Hospitals, for the most part, are private entities, and so they're not, housed in the usual government repositories that we're used to looking at. You might have to go think outside of the box and look for various archives, state archives, a local historical society. If the hospital was part of a university, there might be something in their library or archives. Or occasionally you can find something online. For example, this is Cornell Hospital. And it tells you, this is just a listing. The records themselves are not online in this case. But they do have in their archives medical records for some of these hospitals. And we've got the Bloomingdale Asylum, the Lying In Hospital, an infant asylum, and so on. Now, just a word about terminology. An asylum was not necessarily mental illness, which is what we sort of associate it with today. An asylum was essentially a specialized hospital, which is why we see the asylum for lying in women. A lying in hospital was an obstetric hospital, a maternity hospital. And so that particular hospital was specialized in obstetrics, and similar, the infant asylum and such. Another common example was a tuberculosis asylum, which is where patients, basically specialized for treatment of patients with tuberculosis. Now, some hospitals' records are online. Sometimes you get lucky. This is actually on Ancestry, and this is a naval hospital. And they have their general register of patients. And we have the patient's name, where they're from, their age, their occupation, again, their naval occupation, so their rank and their occupation, when they were admitted, when they were discharged. And, and here we have, again, their cause of illness, what caused them to be admitted to the naval hospital. And, again, and Navy is predominantly, healthy young men, but they have, peritonitis, syphilis, diarrhea, contusion, and so on. So various causes of illness, not necessarily a cause of death, but certainly a disease that may have affected them. This is a transcription of a report to the trustees for the blind. And this was sent to the General Assembly in Indiana. And basically this was a record. Again, this is online, accessible. And here you have listing of people who are being treated or, hospitalized for blindness, what they thought the cause of blindness was. And again, for genealogical purposes, their address and their parents or their guardian. But here we have, if you have an ancestor who was blind, and you may get a clue to some other illnesses there. Military records are a great source for information about our ancestors' health. So if your ancestor fought and applied for a pension, sometimes they would apply for an invalid pension, because if they had some sort of a disability stemming from their military service, they might be eligible for a higher rate. Now, this is one of my ancestors, and he fought in the Civil War, and he was applying for his pension. And he had all sorts of problems. He had rheumatism, piles or hemorrhoids, gunshot wound of his hip, disease of his heart and lungs. He was really trying to go for that increased rate in his pension. I can't say how much of that was actually caused from his military service and how much he was maybe exaggerating. But certainly it gives you an idea of what was going on with him. Now that's online, that's on fold 3, where a lot of these pensions are, increasingly being digitized. Sometimes you have to dig a little more. This is a carded medical record at the National Archives in Washington. It is not digitized and not online, and there are tons of these. So if they ever get to be online, it's going to be a long time. But basically, this is a record of the Adjutant General, and he kept track of everybody who was admitted to the military hospital. This is during the Civil War. One of my ancestors' brothers, here's Samuel Forrester, and he was admitted with bronchitis. He was admitted on May 11th and discharged a little over 2 weeks later. So now we know a little bit more about his time in the military, and he had to take 2 weeks off from serving because of bronchitis. Now, another favorite record of our genealogists is the census. And we're all very used to looking at the census and getting the names and the family groupings and their ages and places of birth. But there's also a column here for illness. And this is from the 1880 census. And the question was that the examiner was supposed to ask, the census enumerator, he was supposed to ask, is the person on the day of the examiner visit sick or temporarily disabled? Another one of my ancestors. And at the time of the enumeration, he was suffering from paralysis, and he actually died 2 months later from his paralysis. Now, I don't know what the paralysis was from, a stroke, a spinal cord injury, what, I don't know. But I do know that he suffered from paralysis. Now, from 1850 through 1880 and again in 1910, they asked several questions referring to health history. And these questions varied a little bit from census year to census year. And they're all recorded here in little tick marks. And again, this is 1880 again. And if you answered yes to any of these, you got a little tick mark. And the questions were, is someone in the house blind? Are they deaf and dumb? Are they idiotic, insane, maimed, crippled, bedridden, or otherwise disabled? Again, these are terminology from the 1880s. We have a little bit nicer terminology for a lot of this now. But again, it gives you an idea, perhaps there was, a disabled member of the household. And so now you have an idea what's going on in that household. In 1880, there was actually a separate schedule. If you answered yes to any of those questions, blind, deaf, and dumb, idiotic, and so on, there was a separate schedule that they would fill out based on those answers. And you can find these online. This is actually an index of that special schedule from Indiana, but it gives you a sense of what types of problems these ancestors might have had. Now, they also include paupers and homeless in this special schedule, which may not necessarily be a medical diagnosis. But it's another place to look for these types of records. Now, continuing on with the census, we have the mortality schedules. From 1850 through 1890, there were mortality schedules made, and some 1890 schedules actually remain, where the main population schedule for 1890 was not. But a mortality schedule, basically, again, this is sort of the beginning of public health awareness. And if the enumerator would ask a question such as, has anyone in this household died in the preceding year? And if the answer was yes, they would fill out a separate schedule. So this is an example of the mortality schedule, and this is from 1860. Persons who died during the year ending June 1st, 1860. Again, long before the counties started maintaining those death registers, now you've got at least a month of death and a cause of death. And here you have the person's name, their age, sex, where they were born, the month that they died, their occupation, and then what they died of. So, unfortunately, this is only for the year preceding the census enumeration. So at best, 10% of deaths during that decade. But also you have to remember that the family may have moved. There may be no one left in that household. If that was the remaining head of household had just died, there may not be anybody left to report the death. But again, it's a good place to look, and it's certainly better than nothing, which is what we have with the county records that weren't being kept at that point. Now, the government loves to keep records, and so there's other places to look for government records. And this is similar to that blind listing that I showed you a few slides ago. This is a return. This is to the Secretary of State of Ohio, a listing, and this is a published book that you can find in a library, a listing of the number of deaf, dumb, blind, insane, and idiotic persons in 1856. You've got their name, you've got the nature of their affliction, how long, and the cause, and again, age and sex. And the reason the government did this, they wanted to know who's going to be a public charge. If they've got a certain number of people in a given location that are disabled for one reason or another, this is long before we had, Medicare, Medicaid, and such. And the government needed to know, who are we going to have to support. It's interesting if you look at the natures of their afflictions. We have melancholy, we have dementia, we have, and the causes are actually also interesting too. Chronic mania from a head injury. Here's one from grief, grief, domestic troubles, again. a different time and place. Sometimes you'll find things in your heirlooms, looking through, family photographs and other family heirlooms. This is a photograph of a relative on my ex-husband's side. And this gentleman was in a wheelchair as long as I knew him. So you can clearly see in the family photograph from it looks like Christmas celebration. And so that something, chronically is going on with him. He's in a wheelchair. Well, another family heirloom in this family is a high school yearbook. And actually this one, I found this on Ancestry, but you might have this in your family. And here it lists, this is the Future Farmers of America and the officers for their high school. And he was the treasurer. Okay, big deal. That doesn't really go with our lecture. But here we have, he suffered an attack of polio in October. And so now we know that the reason he's in the wheelchair was he had polio when he was in high school. And he was in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. You might have a family Bible. And sometimes the family Bibles will tell you. For example, here's one. This person died of consumption. Here's a person that died of heart disease. I can't guarantee that your family Bible kept track of all the illnesses, but they certainly might have. It's another place to look. Now, earlier when I showed you the example of the standardized death certificate, I commented on those numbers. And you'll find these a lot in standardized death certificates. So what does that mean and how does that help us? Well, those numbers actually refer to the International Classification of Disease. And this was originated in the late 1800s, again, around the time that public health systems were coming into being. And it was a more unified way of tracking causes of death. Everybody had their own terminology, and this was a way to sort of classify everything together. Started off originally causes of death, and now it's causes of classification of disease. And it's used for insurance billing. So, it's sort of ubiquitous now in terms of healthcare. It's been revised about every 10 years or so. It's revised. We're currently up to the ICD number 11, which consists of 1,250 pages. So it's huge. And there's several additional guides on how to use it, how to modify coding and such. It's changed over time. It originally was very heavy on infectious disease. And again, you have to think back in 1900, people didn't understand a lot about, the causes of disease. But it's changed from infectious disease now to more things like cancer, heart attack, and stroke. We're able to either prevent or cure infectious disease for a large part now, and people are living longer and tending to, suffer from more, old age type diseases. So these codes, and you can find lists of these in especially the earlier ones, digitized online. This is on Google Books. This is the ICD-2. It's the pocket reference for the ICD-2, which was published in 1909. This website, and this is in the handout, gives you links to several of these where they're digitized. Now, it's important to use the edition that was published prior to the patient's death because some of the coding may have changed a little bit. So we'll go through some examples. So this is one of my ancestors, and he died on January 1st, 1920. And his code was 103. So if we're not sure, there's this big ink splotch there, so we're not sure exactly what that might mean. So we go to our ICD-2, which was the most recent edition published before his death, published in 1909, and we look up code 103, and it tells us that code 103 stands for other diseases of the stomach. So his chronic gastritis is what they're referencing there. Another ancestor here died in 1926, and her code is 74A. So we go to the ICD-3, published in 1920. It was published after January 1st, which is why we didn't use it for the other one. But we go to ICD-3 and we look up this. I found this on the Wolfbane website, and we look it up, and 74A, cerebral hemorrhage. Now, we can probably read this, but if you're having trouble reading their handwriting, this can actually be very helpful if you're not sure exactly what the doctor sort of scrawled on their death certificate. Now, I mentioned earlier that some of the terminology was outdated and antiquated, very archaic terms. There's two websites, and these are both on your handout as well, that are good places to look to see what exactly does that term mean. And here's an example. And this one downside of doing a Zoom lecture is it's hard to do back and forth with this. I would toss this out and ask the audience what they thought this was. But this is an example. This is apoplexy. Okay, apoplexy, not a term we hear nowadays. Well, we can go to one of those websites and look it up and find out that it is paralysis due to stroke. Another one, cerebral hemorrhage. We all, pretty sure we know what that is now. But this person had Bright's disease. Okay, what exactly is Bright's disease? It is basically chronic renal failure, chronic disease of the kidneys. This poor baby, this is a 6-month-old who had suffered from chronic indigestion since birth and had dropsy. And dropsy is another one of those terms that doctors didn't really know what caused it. Excuse me. But they said, okay, well, this patient is all swollen, so we're calling it dropsy. Nowadays, we would probably attribute it either to congestive heart failure or chronic kidney failure. This is kind of hard to read. This came from an invalid pension application. But this soldier was complaining of phthisis pulmonaris, PHTHISIS. So we look up phthisis and we find out that it is pulmonary consumption. Now, consumption is another one of those terms that you really don't hear very often these days. So we have to look up consumption, and it's basically tuberculosis. So this person suffered from pulmonary tuberculosis. So why do we care? Why is it important that we know this? Well, as I've already mentioned, it can give you clues to future research. It can give you clues about maybe your ancestors' occupation, maybe clues about their lifestyle, and it gives you details. It sort of puts the meat on the bones when we're talking about what the ancestor's life was like. It's also important to know, to see if any particular diseases run in the family. So I made a little chart for myself, and this is myself. And basically I put all of my ancestors and I listed their cause of death, if known. Some of these I didn't know. And I listed their cause of death. And just to sort of make it a little more understandable, I color coded them. So my father died of heart disease, as did both of my grandparents on my mother's side, as did several other ancestors. That's what the blue is. These ancestors in green had cancer. Purple is some sort of neurologic, a stroke or something similar to that. Here we have Bright's disease down here in orange. The reason I did this was to look at this and say, okay, what do I have that runs in my family? And if I look at this, I say, you know what? I've got heart disease on both sides of my family. I should probably be, careful about, getting checked for heart disease. It just gives us, another piece of information. And, when you go into the doctor for your annual checkup, you just say, you know what, make sure I don't have any, thing brewing with my heart, right? Okay, we're going to move from diseases, at least individual diseases. We're going to talk a little bit about epidemics. Now, an epidemic, Oxford Dictionary defines it as a widespread occurrence of an infectious disease in a community at a particular time. I think we're all familiar with this next term, a pandemic, which is widespread over one or more countries. And so while we've been dealing for the last 3 years with our COVID pandemic, it's important to know that our ancestors suffered from epidemics and pandemics in the past as well. So an epidemic usually occurred in cycles. It was often seasonal based on the type of illness. It was more common in cities because people tended to be clustered closer together. Epidemics that were based in, say, sewage and waterborne illnesses and such, again, tended to be more common in cities. And whole families might be affected. One family member would come down with the disease and the mother or the older siblings would, be taking care of them, and then they would be affected as well. Epidemics are infectious cause. It could be bacteria, it could be virus, but they are infectious and therefore can be spread from person to person. One of the most feared epidemics earlier was smallpox. And smallpox could have, up to 35% mortality in adults. And, 4 out of 5 infected children might die. Now, smallpox is caused by a virus. And Jenner, in the late 1700s, actually introduced inoculation. He would take a small part of deactivated virus, heat-killed virus, and inject it. And the body would form an immune reaction so that when the body was faced with a larger dose of the actual virus, they were better able to fight it. And that's basically the theory behind vaccination today. Well, when Jenner introduced this in 1796, people were like, you're nuts, you're not injecting that into me. And so he was kind of poo-pooed. But later on, again, in sort of the mid-1900s, smallpox vaccination became more trusted and more widespread. And, I think all of us of a certain age have that little mark on our shoulder from our smallpox vaccination. Our children don't get smallpox vaccinations anymore because this was a triumph for medical science. They were able to eradicate the disease. There is no more smallpox out there to be had, except in a vial in a lab that's hopefully locked away. But we don't require people to be vaccinated against smallpox anymore. Another epidemic was cholera. Now, cholera is a waterborne infection. And it happens again in cities, hot, humid weather, and it results in vomiting and diarrhea. So if you can imagine the cities, 200 years ago, they just, the privies, and they just tossed it into the street, and it was just nasty. And that's, helped the spread of cholera. It's interesting because it was actually thought, again, people didn't understand medical science very well at the time, and they thought it was due to bad air, so you had to be temperate, don't drink cold water, make sure you don't sit in a draft of air, and so on. If you're really interested, you can read, there was a Cholera Gazette that published, statistics and such about cholera, and that's on archive.org if you're really interested in reading about it. Typhus is caused by bacteria that are carried by lice. So if you're in an overcrowded situation where there's a lot of lice, it's possible that you could be subjected to a typhus epidemic. And which kind of gives you the understanding of its nicknames, jail fever or camp fever, jail, were crowded conditions. They didn't change their clothes that often. They didn't wash their clothes every time they wore them, and could get typhus. Now, yellow fever is a viral disease. It's spread by mosquitoes. And this is still a problem in certain parts of the world. So if you're traveling to South America or Africa, you're going to go, traveling in the Amazon or something like that, it's recommended that you get a vaccination for yellow fever. But it's a viral disease spread by mosquitoes. It's nausea and vomiting, and it can lead to almost a 50% mortality. This is a listing of deaths in Philadelphia in 1798, and they had 5,000 people die in the span of a couple months from yellow fever. And this listing of deaths, it's interesting because it's how many deaths were reported on a given day, and it's subdivided into the church. The church that these people attended, St. Mary's Church, the Quakers, the Swedes, the Lutherans, and so on. And that's predominantly because that's who was doing the reporting, was the ministers in those churches. Now, there's other epidemics that were essentially childhood illnesses, and we don't see a lot of these anymore because our children are routinely vaccinated for these diseases. And one would be measles, scarlet fever, diphtheria, and so on. So measles, again, we've been vaccinated, our children are being vaccinated for measles. And not only is it because it's, a disease at the time with the fever and the rash, but it can actually have some lasting effects. This is one of my ancestors, an invalid pension. And one of his, he had contracted measles when he was in the Army during the Civil War. And he complained of measles that was affecting his eyes. And he actually was nearly blind for the rest of his life, probably a result of the measles that he had gotten during the Civil War. And then there's the influenza pandemic 100 years ago, otherwise known as the Spanish flu. It was actually a pandemic. It was worldwide. This occurred at the end of World War I, and a lot of countries were noticing that they had healthy young adults that were suffering from influenza and dying. Spain was the first country to actually speak up and say, hey, I think we've got a problem going on here. And so immediately everybody sort of pointed to them and said, oh, it must have come from Spain. Well, it wasn't the Spanish flu, but that's sort of the name that it's known by. But again, healthy young adults, servicemen, and they're all living in the barracks, 20 of them in the same room, whatever. And so it was very easily passed along from one person to another. Now, how do you find out if there was an epidemic that affected your ancestors in their time and place? And sometimes these records may be incomplete. Now, this is a Rumsey map based on 1870 federal census. And remember that some of those censuses asked, is anybody currently, suffering from any illness? And that's sort of the basis of this map. And here we see, New England had several people suffering from consumption. We've got malaria. I think this one's malaria down here, and typhus. This is intestinal disease, so that's not really an epidemic. But you can see how it's sort of clustered in certain communities. Now, some of the ways that we can find these are some of the records that we were looking at anyway. So cemetery records. Here we have, this is a record of from New Haven, Connecticut, of the various burials during a month-long period. And you see, we've got people dying of phthisis. Remember, that's tuberculosis. We've got scarlatina, and lots of phthisis. So there were some epidemics happening in New Haven in 1843. Death records again, and these are from New England, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, who were keeping death records long before our Midwestern states were. But here you can get a clue that there's something going on with various epidemics, excuse me. For example, here in Coventry, the bill of mortality, and it doesn't tell you what they died of, but you've got, this Ephraim Coleman had lost 3 children. E. Cushman lost 4. Lots more children, and a few adults here, but a lot of children. Well, there was a smallpox epidemic in 1775 in New England. And so likely that's what all of these children died of. Newspapers give us a lot of insight into epidemics. This is one page out of a single issue of a newspaper from 1918, talking about the influenza epidemic. And you see, in one column here, we have several deaths, died, due to pneumonia following influenza, brief illness with influenza, and so on. Camp Sherman, which was a training camp for the Army during World War I. We think that the epidemic is gone, but we're still going to quarantine. Again, more information. There's deaths in Chicago. There's deaths in other locations. Boston police are actually using something called a mask to help protect themselves against this epidemic. Again, and more information on the quarantine. So that's just one page out of one newspaper, all this information about the epidemic. I love local histories. Local histories give us a lot of information about what our ancestors' lives were like. And this is an entry in the history of Fairfield County, Ohio, that talks about the typhoid epidemic that happened during 1823. And of course, it's very flowery languages. Its ravages are believed not to have seeded in the continent at any age, and so on. One should inspect the gravestones. You'll see all the stones bearing the date of 1823. It is said that at some portion of the time, there were not enough well persons to nurse the sick and bury the dead. And that's one of the reasons why some of these records are a little spotty. You know, they were busy trying to cure their friends and relatives and, you know, and bury them, you know, basically take care of them. They didn't have time to stop and jot down their records. So that's why some of our records are a little bit incomplete for epidemics. Now, if you want to learn more about epidemics, or you think, you know, you find a cluster of deaths in one of your ancestors' families, and you want to see if there was an epidemic in that time and place, there's a couple websites that you can look at. Wikipedia has a list that goes back through, I know, ancient Greece, all up to present day, worldwide. This Joyce Tice website has U.S. epidemics from 1616 up until the present. And of course, we're all familiar with today's pandemic. In April, it was said that we had 7 million deaths from COVID worldwide. And COVID is number 4 of all time for deaths, behind things like the bubonic plague, the 1918 influenza pandemic, and the HIV/AIDS pandemic. So we are living in a historic time, and I would urge you to leave some sort of a record of what's happening now for your descendants. You know, and if you do that by writing it down or recording it, or, you know, blogging, YouTubing, whatever you do, TikTok, I suppose, I don't know. Leave a record, you know, let them know what your life has been like the last 3 years. Talk about how, you know, all of a sudden everything shut down and we couldn't leave our houses for, you know, a few months. And, you know, talk about shortage of toilet paper at the grocery store, and, you know, just, you know, people had to be homeschooled. Yeah, you know, however it affected you personally, I urge you to leave that for your descendants, just like we like finding out about our ancestors. 100 years from now, somebody might be interested in what you went through in the last few years. These websites are on the handout, just sort of, you know, a few more ideas for future reading. And I want to thank you for your attention. And I guess if there's any questions, maybe Rebecca, you can look in the chat and see if there's anything.
Yeah, we do have a question in the chat. Says, the oddest diagnosis that I've seen is senile decay. Do you think this is comparable to dementia?
Most likely. It's hard to say. You could check one of those websites and see with the archaic terms and see if it's on there. But, you know, again, it's people describe things what they saw without necessarily the benefit of, you know, modern technology. So it's hard to say whether that was a mental thing or if it was, you know, they became, you know, frail, you know, heart disease, whatever. It's hard to say.
And Joyce says, thanks, very informative. I learned a lot.
Well, I'm glad you did. I hope you can, you know, find some information about your own families using some of this.
Claire says, this was fascinating. Thank you for sharing your expertise.
You're welcome.
And I will mention, you had mentioned Fold 3 as one of the places, like for military records, you mentioned Ancestry. I just wanted to let our patrons know, with your Carol Stream Library card, you have access to both of those resources for free. So Fold 3 is the military records that you can access from home through our website. And then Ancestry, you do have access to that when you're inside the library. And if you have any questions about how to use them, how to get access, how to get on there, just visit us or call us, come into the library, and we're happy to get you started on those.
Fold 3 is a great resource, not just for military, but they've got a lot of other government type records as well. and more going up there.
Did anybody else have any other questions before we end for the night? Give everybody a chance to. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Snaggy. This was so interesting, and I think I learned a lot as well. I'm excited to go and check records as well to find out more about my own family. So thank you again.
Okay, well, thank you for having me.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night.